In the feast of St. Bruno, who brought back the Carthusian life, brought back the discipline to the monastic life about 1,000 years ago, shortly before the life of St. Bernard. St. Bruno would be the inspiration of St. Bernard, and then St. Bernard would be the one who would bring about a great reform in the church in the 1100s. But also we have in the scripture reading today the beginning of the tale of Mattathias. And Mattathias is the father of the 5 Maccabees. So we're reading from the book of, as you know, when we read through the breviary, we read through the entirety of the Bible. We read through excerpts starting with Genesis chapter 1, going all the way through the Bible. And now we have arrived at the book of Maccabees in the reading in the breviary and the liturgy today. And the Mattathias is the man that applies very much to our age. And we look at the history of the Old Testament and the history of the New Testament, and we'll see that they match each other. That the beginning was a creation and the revelation to Adam. At the beginning of the New Testament, we have Jesus Christ coming and the revelation to the 12 apostles. And we have a great age of separation in the Old Testament, which is the flood. And then the Jews are separated from the other people. A great age of separation in the New Testament, which is the age of the martyrs, and then the spreading of the faith slowly throughout the world. Then there's an age of corruption. The age of corruption, which fits in the Old Testament, the last 400 years, or 500 years before Christ, in which the Jews no longer worshipped false idols like they did in the days of Solomon, but they changed their ideas about Christ. They changed their teaching about Christ. They became heretics about the Messiah. As they were getting closer and closer and closer to the time of the coming of the Messiah, they knew the time of his coming from the prophecy of Daniel. And so as they were getting closer and closer to his coming, they began to change their ideas about what the Messiah was. Instead of being the Redeemer, he became a man who was going to come and conquer the Romans and make the Jews rich. He became a material Messiah. And they were no longer looking for a Messiah that was supernatural and going to redeem the world. They changed their ideas about the Messiah. And during this time, there was a punishment sent to the Jews, the punishment of King Antiochus. And King Antiochus was the king of the Assyrians who attacked the Jews in about 165 BC. And King Antiochus, when he attacked the Jews, he set up, he abominated the temple. He sent in pagan priests in the temple. In fact, he sent Jewish priests in the temple who had begun to worship the false gods. And the very correct priests who were supposed to be priests of the true God became false priests. And then in the true temple became false worship. And he set up the abomination of desolation in the holy place. And then he set up gymnasiums all over Israel. And he had a great love of Greece, and the Greeks were famous for their sports and for their love of pleasure. And so he began to spread the love of sports and the love of pleasure throughout Israel. And through this he got the Jews to abandon the true God and begin to worship the false god. And then the gymnasiums became very popular all over Israel. And the Jewish people began to leave the faith by the thousands and thousands and thousands. So the majority of Jews were no longer believing the Jewish religion. And the priests left, and the people left. And then Antiochus set up a statue of himself. After he had done the moral corruption of the Jewish people, he then set up a statue of himself to be worshipped. And he put the statue inside of the temple. And this was of himself to be worshipped as a god. And then the Jews fell away and began to worship him as a god. At that time, Mattathias, who was an old man, called together his 5 sons. And this is where it begins the book of Maccabees. And the book of Maccabees, interestingly enough, has dropped out of the Protestant Bible. Now some Protestants have put it back in, the last books of the Old Testament. But Martin Luther didn't like the book of Maccabees, the 2 books of Maccabees, and so he threw them out. But the book of Maccabees, chapter 2, first book of Maccabees, Mattathias gathers together all of his 5 sons. And he says, look at Jerusalem. Look around and see Jerusalem, and see that all of our people have left the true God. And our people have gone after pleasure. And our people have turned away from God, and all follow after the king. But even if everyone follows after the king, and even if everyone follows after the false god, I and my 5 sons, we will never turn away from the true God. And then he gave a sermon to his sons. And there were 5 of them. The first named John and Simon and Judas and Eleazar, and then Agar, the 5 sons. And the greatest of them was the 3rd son, Judas. And Judas was called Maccabees, which means the hammer. Because though he was not the oldest son, he was the greatest warrior and the greatest spirit of all the 5 sons. And therefore he gathered together his 5 sons, and he says, you will be all under the leadership of Judas. Judas will lead you. Let him fight the fight against the enemies of God. And you other 4, even the 2 older ones, follow Judas. And then all of you will fight. They were all priests. All 5 of them were priests, and they were warriors. And then Mattathias told them that they must never compromise with the spirit of the world. And they must never compromise with the ways of the enemies of God. And they must remember the history of the Jewish people. He said, remember the history. Remember that Daniel would not worship the false god. He was thrown into the lion's den, and he was saved from the mouth of the lions. Remember that Elias would not compromise, and he was saved from the attack of a great army. And God used his power through Elias to defeat the 400 priests of Baal. Then he went through all of the men of the Old Testament, how in time of trial they stood up. Abraham believed in the time of trial. And Jacob, though he would not do that which was evil, knew that it would turn to his own death. And he fled from the face of his own brother. And yet God brought him back in glory. He went through all of the examples of the Old Testament. And remember, they said to his sons, that whoever has confidence in God in the battle, God will never fail him. Whoever remains faithful to God, even if the whole world turns against God, God will give him strength. For never has it been known that a man who has been faithful to God has lost strength in the face of the enemy. And therefore, be brave and fight against the enemy. Then Mattathias sent his 5 sons off to battle, and then he died. All 5 of his sons would be killed. And the story of the life of those 5 sons is the story of the life of the Maccabees. And they would be killed. And in their own lifetime, Israel would not be brought to glory. It would be only after the life of Simon, who was the oldest of the Maccabees. His son was a little boy when he was murdered. The last of the Maccabees to die was Simon. And he was killed through treachery. He could not be killed in battle, and so he was killed through treachery. He was invited to a banquet, and he was killed, and his wife was killed, and all of his children were killed. But then his youngest son, John Hyrcanus, a little baby, there was a servant lady of his enemy who saw the little baby about to be slain, and she grabbed the little baby, John Hyrcanus, and she ran out of the temple. Ran out of the palace. And then she was chased by her own people, but she escaped, and they were not able to find John. John then lived, and he raised up, and he became a king. And when he came back, he conquered all of Israel and brought Israel to a great age of glory about 100 years before Christ. And he would reign for 40 years. And his 40 years of glory of Israel under John Hyrcanus, the son of the Maccabees. The Maccabees created the fight. The Maccabees ended the abomination of desolation in the temple. The Maccabees helped the people, the Jewish people, to turn away from the impurities and the ways of the Greeks. Then they all were killed in that fight. None of them would see the true and final victory. They saw a brief victory, but not the true and final victory. After they were all dead, then their son, John Hyrcanus, came. And he came, and he's after the book of Maccabees. He's not recorded in the book of Maccabees except his childhood. And then he came, and he brought a brief age of glory. And this will be mimicked in our age. We're now in an age of crisis. And those who are fighting in the crisis may not see the end of the crisis, like 4 of the Maccabees' sons. And then, or all 5 of them actually, even though there are brief moments of victory during their lifetime. But because of their faith and their fighting, Israel was saved from the heresies of the Greeks, and Israel was saved and brought back to glory similar to the age of Solomon for a brief time before the Romans came and conquered Israel, and then it was the conquered people when Christ was born. And so we read about the great Mattathias, an old man whose inspiration inspired his 5 sons to stand firm in the faith. And a new Mattathias in the age today is Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who founded the Society of St. Pius X, and who is the father of all traditional Catholics. And he stood up stood up alone against all the modernists in the church, and then men were able to gather around him and stand up for the fight. And it will be later on that the victory will come. There are signs of the victory right now in the church, but the victory will come later on when the church fully returns back to the true faith. And in any case, the great example we have in the sacred scripture is Mattathias. It'd be good to read his speech in Maccabees, chapter 2. First book of Maccabees, chapter 2. So I want to indicate to close with that, and God bless you all. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.